Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. Just before I forget, tomorrow's show is an hour later. I just put it back a bit earlier on, so check the schedules to make sure you don't arrive too early for tomorrow's show. So it's 8 p.m. UK time tomorrow. Anyway, recently we have viewed the use of the atomic bombs against Japan primarily through the eyes of Oppenheimer and the scientists. In Hiroshima Men or Hiroshima Men, and we'll get Iain's interpretation of how to pronounce it in a few minutes. Iain MacGregor takes the view to those on the ground, those in the air, those in Japan, journalists. It widens the lens basically from just the scientists to a whole plethora of people, but 4 particular ones. You can buy the book at your favorite bookstore, or there, as always, links below. So I'll bring Iain now. Good evening, Iain. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you, Woody. It's great to be on the show again. It's been a while.
It's been a while, yes. So we were just talking about the perennial subjects that get talked about in World War II history, and
Yeah.
D-Day and Midway and Colditz and the Dam Busters, and the dropping of the atomic bombs. It has been talked about. It was an absolute turning point in World War II, in that it heralds a new age, a new nuclear age. The clouds loom large 80 years on. Why did you take on the subject? What did you feel that hadn't been said before?
Well, it's a massive subject, obviously. You could write a volume set on it from all different perspectives because there's so many people involved, so many countries involved. It truly is like a winds of war subject within World War II. It's like my previous book with Stalingrad. The world didn't even know the book on Stalingrad unless it was original and interesting. So I came at it from a completely original angle, which no one had covered before. So with this one, weirdly, I was in Volgograd researching the Stalingrad book when I was in their private collection in their archives. And downstairs, they've got various presents from different countries, dignitaries, and cities to kind of mirror, we suffered just as much as you. Here's a prize, whether it's the Stalingrad sword or whatever. And one of the presents was the atomic dome, the wreckage of the atomic dome that they'd been given by Hiroshima in the 1950s. And that logged in my brain. And then when it came to thinking, right, I'd like to write a new book, and it's all about the research, I thought, can I do something that's relevant, that's new, that hasn't been done before? And then the angle is the Hiroshima Men, which I'll talk about in the slides that I've got, and the reason why. But I just wanted to do something that charts this enormous conflict, the Pacific Campaign. And I'll say from the off, this book is not about giving you blow by blow the Pacific Campaign. It's not about that. It's just showing you the different journeys 4 key characters took to get them to Hiroshima and then after Hiroshima. So the men you can see on the front, I'll talk my way through them. And this is all original research. So from top left going clockwise, you've got John Hersey, who was a Pulitzer Prize-winning war journalist. To his right, you've got, or to the right, you've got, I think most people will know, that's Colonel Paul Tibbets II, who flew the Enola Gay. Bottom left is the guys behind the Manhattan Project, and I'm concentrating on General Leslie Groves because he's a fascinating character. You don't really see so much of him in the film Oppenheimer. It's primarily more about Oppenheimer himself, obviously. And then the real key character, which I think, again, as a historian, and you're hoping to get original news research, this really just hit all the buttons. That this guy is the mayor of Hiroshima who died instantly. His name's Senkichi Awaya, and lost to history. Just completely no one knew who he was, other than obviously his surviving family who still live in Tokyo. And I was lucky enough when I was doing my research over in Japan, his family in 1965 put together a posthumous memoir of his life, 1 copy, and it's
Wow.
It's in the Tokyo National Library. And I got it and translated it. And so I talk about, because his life's fascinating, and obviously he died instantly, but the ramifications of what the war did to his family is a metaphor for the war that the Japanese suffered. So it's just all original angles, all with brand new either interviews or research.
Brilliant. And as I said in my top of the show there, that everybody watching that's the most recent examination of it, and it deserved lots of the plaudits it got, and I felt it was a little bit long, the movie, and the last little bit after Test dragged a bit, but
Yeah.
this is the framework we're coming at this
Yeah.
story recently.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's why with my presentations I start with this, because obviously people have seen it, they know it, and it is a good movie. It's a very good movie. Obviously, the CGI is incredible. But I have at the start of my presentation saying, well, that's just only one thread of the story. Obviously, Oppenheimer is key to the building of the atomic bomb, key to the Manhattan Project, et cetera, et cetera. But everything else around it, there are so many pivotal characters. You could pick a dozen of them. I've just chosen 4 because they're all really strong stories, and it gives you a very logical progression to Hiroshima and then after Hiroshima. So I start with this to say, right, well, you've seen this. Now I'm going to tell you a whole multi-layered set of stories, because what I wanted to show, which is again, this is the next logical shot, is on your left is very traditional shot of Hiroshima itself, how most Japanese cities looked before the war, as in the traditional mixed with slightly the modern. So you've got very huge swathes in towns and cities of traditional Japanese 2-story buildings made of paper and wood. But interspersed with that are obviously solid concrete new buildings, whether they're schools, academies, military buildings, technological buildings, science buildings, etc., etc. On the right-hand side, again, your guys watching this will know that's what happened after the bomb on Hiroshima on the 6th of August. That's what we call now the atomic dome, but that was one of the main buildings near ground zero, because it was built with reinforced concrete. It managed to withstand, to a degree, the blast, and that's how it survived. So I'm trying to take the reader on right. I'm going to show you on this journey how we get from that picture to this picture. And this is the main crux of what I'm talking about. And remember this shot, because there'll be a shot towards the end of this presentation where this is what I'm talking. This is how I'm trying to change mindsets. So on the one hand, the bomb gets dropped. You've got newspaper headlines all over the world, that obviously on the Allied side, saying we've dropped this spectacular new wonder weapon that's got the equivalent of 15 to 20,000 tons of TNT, depending on which news you get. It was either 15,000 or 20,000, somewhere in between. That was what people were reading. That's what people were celebrating. But this magazine on the right-hand side, that's the New Yorker magazine, a very upmarket, Manhattan-based, basically a consumer magazine, much like Cosmopolitan is to us today, or Vogue. It's full of fashion. It's full of trying to sell you upmarket things like fridges, freezers, cars, TVs, that kind of thing. But this issue, they decided they would turn their whole issue over to talk about what had happened at Hiroshima, what had happened to the survivors, what they were suffering, and what the dangers of nuclear radiation did. This is exactly a year after the bombing on the 6th of August. And this is what turned the whole world's perception upside down about, oh my God, this is what the atomic age is going to bring to us. And it's the kind of what we all know really about atomic warfare, or the consequences of it. The starting gun came from the New Yorker magazine.
Wow.
So what I did was, those 4 guys, this is just to give you some background about the research. So the 4 men I'm talking to you about are on the front cover. On the left-hand side, you've got Paul Tibbets Jr., Paul Tibbets II, for want of a better phrase, the pilot of the Enola Gay, the commander of the 509th Composite Group, hugely decorated World War II veteran, flew the 8th Air Force, led some of the earliest raids over occupied Europe. Incredible man, incredible leader. So to get the gist on him and his background and his character, I didn't want to just rely on books. I wanted to obviously speak to whoever is his family, whether that's still alive. This is his grandson, Paul Tibbets IV. And as you can see, he also joined up in the Air Force in the 80s. And weirdly, just by, maybe he meant it. I don't know. I've never asked him the question. But apart from obviously giving me the full background on his grandfather's life, he was telling me that he actually ended up serving and commanding the same bomber group as his grandfather did in the Second World War. Only, as you can see behind him, he's now flying stealth bombers.
Yeah. Yeah, technology's moved on again. Yeah, yeah.
Slightly,
Great
slightly.
stuff.
And then for John Hersey, who would be again an amazing man. All these people are amazing people. John Hersey was he'd come from a missionary background. He was born in China. He actually spoke Chinese before he ever learned English to speak English. But he's from a very well-to-do, almost blue blood section of American society. So he went to Yale. He was friends with the likes of John F. Kennedy. Uh, helped set up the Skull and Bones Society that we all know about, synonymous with Yale. But he became, like I said, he was a Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist, and he decided that he wouldn't join. He wanted to join up, but then he was persuaded by his friends and colleagues in Manhattan, where he was working for some top magazines and newspapers. They said, you would be better reporting on the war. So that's what he did. And he went everywhere, from the vicious fighting in the Pacific. He started at Guadalcanal and survived. Then he went up into Europe, and he was with, as you can see from this picture, at the landings in Sicily, and then into Europe. Then he went to Moscow and was a reporter there, and was in the vanguard with the Red Army as they were liberating camps of Eastern Europe. And it was only then that when he was back in New York, he got the job to go to Japan to cover Hiroshima. So I interviewed his grandson, Canon Hersey. And Canon, as you can see from the poster behind him, he's at the Tribeca Film Festival. He's an award-winning documentary filmmaker. Is concentrating specifically on the relationship between America and Hiroshima and the atomic bombing.
Wow. Wow.
And then obviously we know who this guy is. So on the right there is General Leslie Groves, after the Trinity Test in the New Mexican desert that showed that the bomb works. And they were now going to progress with getting Little Boy ready to drop on a Japanese city, which would be Hiroshima, standing there with Oppenheimer. This is his mugshot for his security clearance at Los Alamos. And so for Groves, what I did was another grandson. I interviewed his grandson, who's a retired businessman, who's an ex-officer in the US Army. And again, it's one of those things that you think, I am such a lucky person. When I contacted Richard, this was in lockdown, he said, well, I'm actually an amateur historian. I've been collecting material and records on the Manhattan Project and my grandfather for the last 5 years. Do you want to meet up whenever I can come across and we can discuss? So he's been completely invaluable in getting fresh insight into Groves.
Brilliant stuff.
So, and then on the flip side, because I've talked to you a lot about allied people, these are some of the people that I've been talking to as well. So the main photograph in color on the right-hand side, this man's name is Howard Kakita, and he survived the bomb blast. He was 8 years old. I talk about him a lot. I interviewed him. And he's a Japanese American. So he brings a very significant, unique story in terms of, obviously, over 150, 200,000 Japanese lived in America as American citizens, Japanese Americans. They were all interned because of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Howard just happened to be, unluckily, on holiday in Hiroshima when Pearl Harbor happened, and he would remain there with his brother for the rest of the war while his parents were in internment camps in the Utah desert. And he survived the bomb. So he gave a very graphic account of how he survived and how his family survived, his grandparents. Then below him in color, the US Marine, he's professor now. He's Professor Richard Jesser. He's been on a couple of podcasts that I've seen over in the UK, but again, I was very fortunate to meet and interview him. He lives in Colorado. He's 100 this year, and he survived the full duration of the battle on Iwo Jima. So he talked about that, because obviously I talk about that in the book to get you to where we're going in the story. But again, Richard had a very unique take on, because he ended up a professor, an academic professor in Colorado University. One of his friends that he would meet regularly with in the 1950s was Oppenheimer's younger brother, Frank. So again, I've got some very interesting information on that. Pushing to the left, and me sitting with an elderly Japanese lady. She's actually almost 90. You would not believe it if you met her. That is Michiko Kodama, and she's the Assistant Secretary General of the survivors group in Japan called the Nihon Hidanko. And again, her story is the prologue to the book, because what I wanted to do for readers is to just counterbalance in a logical way to say, okay, we are going to talk about what an amazing scientific achievement it was to make the bomb, but also to develop the B-29 bomber that would deliver the bomb. But this is the human consequence of it. So it's not taking sides. It's literally saying that listen to her story and just figure it out for yourself. She was a very special lady. And then this is the family photo of the mayor of Hiroshima, Senkichi Awaya. And again, this is a lovely photo because, again, what I'm saying to the reader is this family is a metaphor for Japan in the war, what would be the consequences of them attacking America unprovoked. 4 members of his family in that photograph, including his wife, died in the Second World War. 3 of them from the atomic blast.
Wow.
So I'll be very quick because there's a few slides here, and I don't want to, I want time for you guys to ask me questions. So I take my audience on a how did we start? So obviously you've got Hirohito on the left-hand side, becomes emperor in 1924. Japan is already heavily westernized, heavy investment in Japan in terms of heavy industry, commerce. They're building up their armed forces to when you get to the right-hand side. And obviously I'm skipping ahead here really quick because I want to get to the end of the slides. They were needed to expand. You've got the home islands, 4 main islands. It's not big in terms of how can you accommodate 100 million people on such a small landmass that hasn't got a lot of essential minerals and supplies to keep such a successful booming economy going. They've got to go abroad. They want to be like the rest of the Western powers that had their own empires in Asia. And obviously they've been supported by America and Britain and France to build up their economies. So they couldn't go into the Pacific as yet. So where they're going to go? They're going to go into China. But when the armies are getting bogged down after 4 or 5 years of vicious fighting, probably 7 or 8 years, they realize even though they've got 1 million men there, it's not going to be an easy win. They still need the essential minerals. Where can they go? This crazy idea, which became their policy, thinks, I know, let's attack the Americans and we'll knock the Allied powers out of the South Pacific. And we can try and seize the oil. It's a bit like when I was writing about Stalingrad and Hitler doing an insane southern offensive into the Caucasus to try and seize some oil, which he never got.
So it seems ridiculous now, 85 years on, but at the time, I must have seemed to most Japanese some kind of sound policy. But yeah.
Well, I mean, they had an incredible armed force of the military in terms of the armed forces on the continent, but then the Imperial Navy. I mean, they're all pushing for we want to show what we can do. And so at Pearl Harbor, they either destroyed or sunk. They destroyed and sunk 19 ships, heavily destroyed and damaged and sunk 19 ships, was it? Killed 2,500 personnel. But it set in train just a monumental catastrophe for them.
Yeah.
So again, this is what I try and show audiences about the size of their empire by the time they finished. By mid-1942, they're dominating the Central Pacific, the North Pacific air basin, and now they're going down into the South Pacific. And it's only at Midway in June 1942 where they're stopped in their tracks. And again, that's for someone who's a specialist on Midway to tell you how lucky the Americans were in terms of, it seemed to me, potluck who can strike the first blow on your aircraft carrier force. Because what it did, the destruction of the Japanese carrier fleet made the Americans have parity at that point in their aircraft capability. And it just gave the Americans then the platform to then launch against this massive perimeter they would have to break through. So my real story starts when Albert Einstein, the foremost physicist in the world at the time, he was past his peak by the time the war started, but he was still a huge name, hugely respected name.
Great hair.
And he's obviously in America by the time, way before Pearl Harbor starts. But he was the one, as I talk about in my story, that it's almost giving the rubber stamp to what other renowned and prestigious scientists were saying the same, that were coming from Europe, that were refugees from Nazi-occupied Europe, that come to Britain, then a lot of them had moved over to America, was the Nazis are thinking about or have the capability and the people. If they want to, they could probably try and produce an atomic bomb.
This is the
Uranium, they're
era
already on the road.
of
Sorry, go on.
theoretical science
Yes,
gradually
exactly.
becoming an application that could be used, isn't it? You know,
Yeah.
you can see that in the reading of it. A lot of the people at the beginning, it's more of a study of intelligence. It's more of a
Yeah.
theoretical what is the physics world out there, and then gradually there's this recognition that other people are thinking about the same thing from a darker
But I was
point
going
of
to
view.
say it's the spectre of one side that we all don't like. If they developed a nuclear capability before the rest of us, then God knows what's going to happen. So
Yeah, absolutely.
this is a point where Roosevelt obviously already had his arsenal for democracy. He's almost on the brink of offering lend-lease to the Allies eventually. And he's already set in train different departments, different heads of departments that are going to action the expansion of the armed services on all areas, land, sea, and air, but also science innovation. And Vannevar Bush on the right-hand side, he would be a key player in making Roosevelt's desire, because all it was the president decides we are going to put money into a B-29 long-range bomber program. We're going to put money into this, the Manhattan Project, which it would become. It'd be coined the Manhattan Project. Vannevar Bush would be the man who would oversee it. So the man he chose, this is, I love this photo of General Groves. He was a colonel in this photo. His grandson gave me this photo. And because he's in his old uniform, because he'd insisted when he was given the job to run the Manhattan Project, he was just a colonel at the time. And he said, well, I want to be a general because if I'm dealing with these world-renowned scientists, they're not going to respect me as just your everyday colonel. Even though I've built on the right-hand side, I was the guy who managed successfully and brought on time, on budget, the Pentagon, at the time the largest building in the world when it was finished. So here he is. He's with the Army of the U.S. Army of Engineers in his uniform there. He would be the driving force. Out of all the characters I talk about in the book, I would say he's the one guy I would meet above all others. I would just like to meet this guy because he was just so driven. All the reports I've read about him, all the letters and diary entries from lots of different people, all had the same analysis. Just
In the
hard
sidebar
drive.
right at the beginning, people identifying him as being much more pivotal to this project than Oppenheimer himself in many ways, in the kind of the
Yes.
Eisenhower behind it. And it's a pity that he was a little bit tubby, because I think he's kind of been portrayed a little bit comically over the years,
Yes.
you know, in some
Exactly.
ways, not given the gravitas, because he doesn't
Yeah.
kind of in some ways look like a fighting soldier, especially when that photo you showed standing next to Oppenheimer. He looks
Yeah.
enormous,
Well,
because
he
Oppenheimer was
had
great
he was
thin.
he was famous for having jars of candy which he locked away in his safe constantly. But no, well, he saw the bigger picture. That's the key
Yeah,
thing. He saw the bigger picture. And when you think again, if you guys can Google it, if you go online and say, "Show me a map of the Manhattan Project," it's continental wide. It's employing hundreds of thousands of people.
yeah,
Most of them didn't even know what they were working on. And this is a guy who, probably only got 4 or 5 hours sleep every day.
yeah,
And he's constantly, not just at Los Alamos, which we've got here, he's going to Hanford, he's going to all the various sites around the country, making sure that some of these industries were built from the ground up. I mean,
yeah.
literally, he signed off, and he's got billions of budgetary funds to spend over the next 3.5 years. And this is why I was talking. I was talking to a professor of physics today, and I said there's one word that sums up the Manhattan Project. It's speed.
Yeah.
It's incredible. If you think about from literally a piece of paper in 1940, where they're thinking this could potentially be what we need to do. They've split the atom, uranium 235, et cetera, et cetera. And within 4 years, they've developed the bomb and they've developed the plane that they're going to drop it on their enemy. It's just incredible. It's space age. So you'll have to read the book because again, I go into heavy detail about how he set up the Manhattan Project. I obviously go into a lot of detail about Los Alamos and the staff and the personnel that were there. And obviously I go into detail about Oppenheimer, the man.
Yeah, brilliant.
And I'll just very quickly talk about Hersey. So like I said, bottom left, he was at Guadalcanal. So amazing. One of the amazing facts about this book is Hersey survived 4 plane crashes in the war on the front line, whether it was in the Pacific or whether it was in the Mediterranean. He should have died. And always, 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 he had his notebook watertight in a Durex or a phylactic tube, or whatever you want to call it. He won the Pulitzer Prize. It's the Belfredano. He won this from his memoirs of seeing the fighting in Italy. Again, I would highly recommend it. It sold millions of copies. It put his name on the map. But what also put his name on the map to get him as much attention, and I would say kudos with the American military that got him into Japan later, was that's JFK on the right-hand side after he'd had survived his PT boat escapade. He was sitting in a nightclub with John Hersey in Manhattan in 1944, thinking, A, his military career's over, he's severely injured, what's he going to do? And C, his dad's pushing him to go into politics and he's not so sure. And it was after John Hersey talked to him, he said, you've got the elements to make a great story. And it was John Hersey that put JFK on the map as a military hero in the United States. He wrote up his story of that accident. Well, not that accident, the survival of his PT boat.
And the coconut and all that stuff. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And here's the thing that I found out afterwards was his dad, Joe Kennedy, the senator, bought 100,000 copies of the issue John Hersey's story was in about his son and saved them. So when John F. Kennedy ran for Congress for the first time in Boston, they carpet bombed the place with the magazine to say, my son's a hero.
Wow. The ever visionary Joe Kennedy there. Yeah. What an amazing figure he was. But back to the presentation.
Yes, sorry, I'll be very quick now. We'll skip through this. This is Hap Arnold. He's the father of the B-29. Again, I go into a lot of detail about his background. This is a man who learned to fly with the Wright brothers. Incredibly, he's basically sitting in a wooden kite, and he would develop and oversee, like Groves was overseeing the Manhattan Project. This man delivered the B-29. It's an incredible story.
Yeah, visionary. Yeah, there's the
B-29. And this is what the B-29 at the Wichita plant, which is the focus of my story, which I talk about that because again, that one, there were several factories around the continent, but the one in Wichita, Kansas was incredible.
Brilliant.
And then obviously I talk about Tibbets because Tibbets, the man, I think you're going to love him or hate him. He's Marmite because he dropped the bomb. And I'll mention that right at the end. So I just wanted to get into his character about, he saw some of the hardest fighting there is to do in the air and survive, watched a lot of his friends die. And I would argue, and I said this to his grandson, I said, I think he probably had PTSD before they even gave him the job to command the 509th. But very hard driven. And like Groves, he had a bigger picture about him as well. I mean, he'll say, I was following orders, but he had a very good, solid science background to the point where Oppenheimer and he were talking constantly about how they could adapt the bomber with the bomb.
I always feel it, in previous portrayals, the above and beyond film from the 50s with Robert Taylor is that he was always, whatever he said, it was wrong. If he just said I was just a chauffeur, I was a pilot, I was following orders, he's kind of showing himself to be a lack of compassion. But if he tried to kind of show sympathy for victims, it was like, pull yourself together, pull your big. Whatever he did, it seemed to be the wrong thing. If he'd said nothing, it'd have been wrong. If he talked about it all the time, it was wrong. And so,
exactly,
I always felt he felt a bit hard done by in my eyes. He couldn't get it right.
But what I say, Woody, in the book is he was given so much power to get what he wanted, to put this elite team together. He had to use the code name Silver Plate. I just think he made a lot of enemies along the way because generally his career was curtailed after the war. I mean, he got a few sideline jobs and he ended the war as a brigadier general. Should have earned, should have been a hell of a lot higher. I mean, look at what happened to Curtis LeMay. He went far higher. But anyway. We keep on moving, and that's the composite group. Overnight, this is his training his teams. It's just incredible how he did it. Again, super driven. He was allowed to recruit the best of the best navigators, bombardiers, co-pilots, everything. So, and they
And
trained.
you know, I'm interrupting you again, but that
No, no, go.
recruitment there, it was kind of like the Doolittle raid of its era, wasn't it? You know,
Yeah.
people were wanting to, like, or the Dam Busters raid. It was, you know, the word got out that it was something cool to be part of. They didn't necessarily know what it was going to be, but there was this, something's happening. There's an elite
Yeah.
unit being put together, and that side of things is fascinating, a little bit overlooked. I'm glad you've covered it.
And they had no idea they were going to get checked to the nth degree by the FBI and the US military service. Then I do talk about in detail, because I just think it's an engineering miracle when they captured at the point of a gun and a lot of the US Marines' lives the Marianas Islands, and they set up the 3 massive air bases on Guam, Saipan,
Yeah.
and Tinian. That's why I wanted this aerial shot in my book, because they built the biggest, at the time, the biggest airports in the world, all to carry 300, 400, 500 B-29s, 20, which would become the 20th Air Force eventually. But this is the view that Tibbets would have seen for the first time as he's flying in to do a recce about a month before his unit arrived. He was in a SkyTrain, I think, and he's just banking over it. And basically, the CB's built this over coral. This is just incredible.
Yeah, and it's
American
that
industrial
weird
wise.
thing that you know, as you said, you know, the Manhattan Project and the B-29 development of that, all that island hopping, all that was just not just, but it was primarily to get those bases closer and closer to Japan to deliver the end of the war
Well,
from the air. You know, and
as,
the
yeah,
Marines and the Army who are taking these islands, yes, of course they're pivotal in what they're doing, but they're basically just getting space. It's
yeah.
real estate for airfields.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, they've been thinking that they needed a long-range bomber capable of hitting somewhere like Japan since the early 30s. It just taken, you know, when war comes, it allows you to spend
Technology
loads
had
of
to
money.
catch up. Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. And again, what I talk about, I do spend a whole chapter talking about the firebombing, the great firebombing raid on Tokyo, because I talk about the development of incendiaries. Excuse me. I talk about the tactics Curtis LeMay in the center there. Implemented low-level, indiscriminate bombing of civilians. Because what I'm trying to show, as well as other elements of the horrific fighting on the islands, was to say there wasn't really any weapon off the table in this fight. It was both sides were prepared to do anything and everything to win. And
Yeah.
when you get locked into that logical, I would call it logical, when you're in that logical kind of mindset, the fact that you would do low-level indiscriminate bombing with incendiaries makes perfect sense to
Yeah.
someone like Curtis LeMay. Even as he's famously watching the bombers take off, he said, "You know, if we lose the war, they'll try me as a war criminal."
Yeah.
But how many people have said that in the Second World War?
Yeah. And the stubbornness of the Japanese had become evident from like 42 onwards, is that
Yes.
as an enemy, they're going to take a lot of convincing to stop. You know, they've shown that with as you mentioned, the fight against the Chinese earlier. They are. I'm not just saying, folks, that an entire nation is stubborn, but the Japanese military policy, that clearly they were not going to break easily.
No. I'm not sure you can click on that, Woody, because if you click on it, it might show you, because it's an interactive map, but I don't think it's working.
No, I just did it on a PDF so I could upload
Don't worry,
it.
don't worry.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, I'll upload it later, but basically, I've got this interactive map. I pinpointed every single city that was bombed just prior to Hiroshima. So, again, people have quoted it before. At least 66 Japanese cities were attacked using incendiaries, mainly incendiaries, but obviously high explosives too. Dehoused 8.5 million people, killed nearly 1 million people, and then you get the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima.
Yeah, no, absolutely, it was massive. Right, on we
Very
go.
quickly. So this is Senkichi Awaya, like I said. Fascinating in terms of it shows you a different side to what we typically think a Japanese leader would look like, in terms of he wasn't gung ho. Not that I've seen anyone. I've been reading his family's memoir. He was a successful bureaucrat. That's what he trained for. He was first generation, gone to university. His dad had helped build the railways, and that's how the family had made money. So he'd been a bureaucrat, and he was basically in charge of police forces. And then he went into the agricultural ministry. Then he came back to, I think he was in charge of police in Osaka. Had a big row with the army, because the army was trying to muscle its way and do what it wanted to do at home on the streets of Osaka, and one of his policemen arrested an imperial soldier, turned into a huge. I mean, if it was the media today, it would be 24/7 news. Turned into a huge us or them against the police, against the army, and he had to back down, but it was very honourably done. But then they forced him into early retirement in 1942, only to bring him out again in 1943, because by then they thought the Americans will invade Japan and they will come from the south. Our main military hub is Hiroshima. We need someone we can trust who can do a good job down there. Will you be the mayor? They didn't say, will you be? They said, you are. And he had to leave. So his family photo is taken in Tokyo because that's where they lived. So this is a family that will disintegrate by the end of the war.
Yeah.
And this is what we're talking about. Again, many historians that have probably talked to you, Woody, and you've had presentations about it too. It's the level of the fighting and the fanaticism and the suicidal fanaticism that the US Marines primarily, and then the American Army, obviously in the Philippines, was up against in terms of trying to keep the enemy away from the home islands at all costs.
Yeah.
Whether it's in terms of kamikaze attacks or an island like Okinawa of well over 100,000 troops and militia fighting to the last man to try and inflict as many casualties on the enemy as possible to try and put them off. But this relentless industrial military American machine was making its way to Japan. They couldn't stop it. Trinity Test. That's exactly what it is. So you've seen Oppenheimer. This is the Trinity Test. This is when they knew it worked, and then they quickly put together. This is the plutonium test that was done, but they quickly put together Little Boy, which would be the uranium-based bomb that would go first. And this is Tibbets. So obviously the 509th landed on Tinian Island, one of the 3 islands, and they're on the massive airbase there, curtailed away in one section of the island. So there's squadrons of B-29s there that are just doing day in, day out, doing their missions over Japan. They are not allowed to get anywhere near the 509th, who are guarded by barbed wire and armed military police. And they're doing their own training, but they're not going on missions. So there's a lot of resentment there, a lot of suspicion. But they were given the job. And once the Trinity Test had worked in July, it's a matter of weeks until the bomb is shipped over to Tinian and it's assembled. And Tibbets, bottom right-hand corner, puts his team together to then go on the fateful mission. Special mission number 13 is the chapter in the book. And there it goes. So it's about 40,000 foot high by that time. I mean, you're talking about when the bomb dropped on ground zero, in an instant, the temperature on the ground is at several thousand degrees, the surface temperature of the sun. It's vaporizing everything in about a mile radius, vaporizing birds in the sky, human beings. If you go to the next slide, human beings standing on the step. These are some of the photos that the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum kindly allowed me to have. And again, a lot of your guys watching this will know the shadows of just the imprint of people that are just happen to be sitting on a step, gone. Watches that might have survived, stopped at the time of the attack, incinerated almost. And then there's only, I think this is something like 4, maybe 5 images of survivors slowly staggering their way out of the destroyed parts of the city. And this is one of them, because that's what they did. Obviously, they had no idea they'd been struck by a nuclear device. They just thought it was just a terrible wonder weapon. But it had consumed square miles of Hiroshima, just incinerated it. And then on the outskirts, it had damaged it. 90% of the hospitals was destroyed. I think 85% of medical personnel dead or dying or wounded. There was nothing for the fire crews to do because the fire crews didn't exist. They'd been vaporized too. So if you're a survivor, and what I talk about in the book, I interviewed 12 survivors and I talk about their stories. I intersperse the chapter with them, different parts of the city. They're all staggering up into the mountains because if any of you have been lucky enough to go to Hiroshima, it's a beautiful city. It's surrounded by just a range of beautiful mountains. And that's where everyone was filtering out to for the next 3 to 4 to 5 days, just to try and get away from the inferno.
There we are, back to the headline.
Yes, so we'll quickly skip over. I mean, again, I showed it at the start. This is what was happening. This is like, we bombed them. Isn't this amazing? We've won the war. And everyone was happy. Next slide. Here we have Truman. Oh, sorry, on the left you have MacArthur overseeing the signing of the surrender, and that's with Truman days later showing it off in the White House.
Mm.
This, I thought, this is one of the first things I found when I was researching the whole book, and I just find it incredible. And I talk about it at the start of the book. So this is in October 15th, Navy Day in the States, which is a big deal, obviously. And they decided to have a nationwide celebration that they'd won the war, and it was called Tribute to Victory. So towns and cities across the United States are having pageants, parades, etc., etc. The veterans are there. Hundreds of thousands of US veterans are coming home from Europe and the Far East. And they had a live radio broadcast from the Los Angeles Coliseum in LA. About 100,000 people were there. Like I said, a lot of them returning vets with their girlfriends and wives. And the whole day was, they had Hollywood set builders, and they literally recreated every major battle America had fought in the Second World War. So it's a cast of hundreds. Cream of Hollywood was in attendance watching. Edward G. Robinson, top right, he was the compere on the stage. And the pièce de résistance, at the end of the night, you've got these Nuremberg-style searchlights. There's 80 of them ringing the stadium. They're all pointing at this silver silhouette that's flying towards them, droning away, gets closer and closer and closer until it's roughly about 300 feet above the audience. And as it flies past Edward G. Robinson, who's commenting on it, it drops what you think is a bomb, and then a make-believe, a theatrical atomic bomb goes up behind the stage and gets a huge roar, gets a gladiatorial roar from the crowd. So if it goes to the next picture, this is what was not being told to the American public, any public, the Allied public, is why were people in their hundreds and thousands dying suddenly from symptoms that all seemed to be the same: internal bleeding, vomiting, dizziness, going into a coma, passing away, or hemorrhaging and passing away. And primarily, obviously, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but people around Japan as well, because lots of people had left and they were now living with different family members around the country. But what MacArthur, top right, now with Hirohito, I mean, MacArthur had supplanted Hirohito as he was in charge of Japan with the Allied forces. What I talk about in the book is the year-long campaign by his press office to suppress any Allied reporter getting to Nagasaki and Hiroshima and reporting what they saw. They didn't have the scientific background to say, this is radiation poisoning. They had no concept of that. But they were talking about, there's a killer disease. What is it? And a couple of writers got away with certain things, but it was easily suppressed back home in the States by the US military censor board, who could obviously make excuses for it, saying, well, they don't know what they're talking about. And even Oppenheimer got involved and sided with the government and Groves to say, well, no, it's too soon to tell whether that could be an actual enormous thing that's happening to the population. And this is where Hersey comes in. So he snuck into Japan. He got given the commission by the New Yorker magazine. He'd written in 1942 a very friendly memoir about MacArthur. Again, you've probably done it on a previous episode. Because of the disaster at the Philippines, he wrote a positive spin on that. MacArthur remembered him. So when it came for him signing off, can John Hersey come into Japan after the war? He said, oh, I like this guy. Yeah, of course he can. Not realizing what he was up to. And then he quickly snuck down to Hiroshima, interviewed a Jesuit priest, Father Kleinssorg, who then said, right, I will take you around the city and I will introduce you to, I think in the end, he interviewed about 32 to 36 people over a 2-week period. And from that, he whittled it down to, there will be 6 main characters, which are what we call the Hiroshima 6, bottom right. And they just give this 360-degree viewpoint, eyewitness account of, well, this is what the bomb did to me on that day. And then his manuscript, his original manuscript that he wrote, is in the Yale University archives, which I visited 2 years ago. And I just sat in there for a week and went through all his personal papers, which is why you're seeing some photographs of him. But this is the manuscript. And again, for a historian, a publisher, so I'm a publisher in my day job, it was just literally my hands were shaking, hairs on the back of my neck. I can't believe I'm reading this, because it's got all the edits in there as well, which was just incredible to see. So it's 30,000 words. It was a long form story, what we would call today, that you'd see in the Guardian or the Times. And they were originally going to have it as a series across 6 episodes, but such was the strength and quality of his writing about the subject, the editor, William Shawn, said, we're just going to make this the whole episode. The whole issue is just going to be Hiroshima. We'll pretend we're going to write something else so the censors won't stop us, which is what they did. And they came out with this. And then the image on the right-hand side is Penguin, Knopf in the US publisher, turned the 30,000 words into a small booklet. Have I got it here? I think I've got it here. Oh, no, I haven't got it here. And it's sold 3.5 million copies since it was published, because it went worldwide. And within weeks, it literally crisscrossed the free democratic world of this is what's happened to Hiroshima. So very quickly, Groves, I'll tell you what happens in a nutshell. Groves, as you've probably seen in the film, it became a battle of wills, battle of egos. He wanted to lead the new atomic agency. He'd made a lot, like Tibbets, he'd made a lot of enemies on the way up because he'd been given so much power to do the Manhattan Project in the war. And he, like I said, he made too many enemies, and Eisenhower in particular didn't like him, and it was Eisenhower who finished his military career. On the right-hand side, that's John Hersey. After the war, he really went back to academia, and he was a professor of English literature at Yale University, gave talks to children around the US, and he generally didn't miss any anniversary at Hiroshima in Japan. He would always go back for that. And then this is Tibbets. So this is him when he was at NATO. So he was at NATO in the 1960s, but he would end his career, like I said before, as a brigadier general. Should have risen much higher, really. But like I said, he'd made too many enemies. And this is a lovely photo of him in the B-29 with his grandson, Paul Tibbets IV. And they were in Texas, and his grandson surprised him and said, look, you haven't been up in a B-29 for decades. I'll take you up in one. Come on, let's go and fly it together. And that's exactly what he did.
Brilliant stuff.
I think we're finished. Yeah. And this, two things. This is no one at the Hiroshima Memorial Museum knew of Senkichi Awaya when I asked them. I specifically wanted to come and research the guy. And then I found the site of where his mayor's residence was. It's about, I mean, as you can see, the Hiroshima Dome is way down there. It's like 1,000 meters away, but it was behind bushes that they erected in 1974, I think, because he was in a pacifist Christian sect. He was a lifelong Christian, and so his Tokyo society ended up erecting that small monument, but it's hidden behind bushes. I literally had to do Google Maps for about 3 hours, going back and forward trying to find it. And then to finish, we talked about Tibbets, but I just find where I end the book, I talk about how Tibbets decided, as you mentioned earlier, Woody, I don't want to be buried at Arlington Cemetery. I don't need to have my grave damaged or even destroyed by any kind of peace activists or anti-nuclear protesters. And he said to his wife at the time, he was French, the happiest I ever was in my career was when I was flying B-17s into Europe. So I want to be cremated, and I want you to take my ashes on a ferry and sprinkle me on the English Channel. And that's what she did.
Wow. Well, brilliant stuff, Iain. And as you can expect, questions have been building up there. The first couple are about Hirohito. So Gary August asked at the beginning how it was reported to Hirohito. And he also talked about the Japanese reaction, which you've kind of covered. And then Jim said, why didn't Hirohito surrender after the first bomb drop? Why did it take the second? So, we've had Paul Hamm on the show a couple of years ago with his view about the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it's a perennial subject that comes up. And, I know your research is primarily into people and what they experience rather than necessarily opinions, but what's your take on Hirohito? Firstly, how was it reported to him? And secondly, why didn't he surrender?
Well, the thing is, one of his closest confidants was Field Marshal Hatta, and he'd known Hatta for years. He trusted him a lot, and Hatta had been given like Senkichi Awaya was made the mayor of Hiroshima because they trusted him. Yeah. Field Marshal Hatta was given the job of being in command of Second Army that was going to defend Kyushu from the initial assault. And Hatta had a direct line Hirohito, and it was actually Hatta was one of the main people he listened to when he flew back to Tokyo. When the argument, this is after Nagasaki had been bombed, and the argument was then raging, because after the first bomb had dropped, they were still prepared to carry on completely. The hardliners were still in the main in charge, and they had the voice of the emperor. They wanted to save his position constitutionally. They weren't going to bow to unconditional surrender and lose the office of the emperor either, because they thought it's going to be societal breakdown. We'll end up like communist Russia. But there was a few people Hirohito would listen to. Hatta was one of them, and he was one of the ones who had said to him right at the end, "We're not going to we're not going to be able to hold them back. There's no way I can stop the Americans advancing through southern Japan. It's not going to happen." And he survived the Hiroshima attack. He was in his headquarters when it happened. That's why he survived. But eventually, it's like being on the Titanic, I suppose. You're trying to hide the reality of what's going to happen, and you can demand that the whole country die in some massive act of suicide by holding off the enemy. But there's more than one enemy. There's two enemies, because Russia's coming into the picture too.
Yeah, that's true. Mustn't forget that.
The country's been starving for 2 years. They've bombed all the cities. Eventually, there will be a breakdown, and that would mean they might turn on the emperor anyway and kill the emperor to get rid of the whole house. So it was his best worst option to surrender.
Mm. And we must also remember the framework of the fact that, as far as his role in Japanese society, he's a living god. So it's not like his advisors can just sort of have a regular chat with him like two blokes in a pub. Exactly. Listen, yeah. Mate, have you realized what's happening there? There's this coded language. And I remember talking to Paul and Ewan MacGregor, forgotten the author's name, about that. When you're looking at the archives, you've got to decipher this diplomatic Japanese cultural language at the time. It's not just a conversation.
And it's the chess moves of all the formalities. So like you just said, there's no huge, constant, heated shouting matches in front of the emperor. Everything is formal, polite, rigid. It's incredible.
So another comment, I should mention it, from ABC. He's saying, oh, my uncle was an officer who worked on the Manhattan Project. He babysat the bomb that was transported by the Indianapolis and helped arm the bomb on the ground, and was one of the last people to. So I love it when viewers have a direct connection with it. Phil Blood wrote your review for your book and is saying that you wrote the survivor story particularly well with empathy. So that's a nice comment from Phil Blood there. You talked about the kind of the cover up of the reaction, the radiation sickness, things like that. But we had some various questions about that kind of the aftermath. So Andreas is asking, did the Americans go in and study the bomb sites later afterwards? Because they understood to some extent, they predicted the science of what the bomb would do in terms of explosion. But the result on the damage on the ground was unprecedented and not what they. So what there obviously were teams going in.
There was teams. I was going to say there was teams that were sent in to assess the overall bombing campaign, the firebombing campaign, and obviously there was top secret teams studying what were the effects of the nuclear blast taking. And again, when I was reading these reports, I was still thinking, well, while these guys were taking their readings and samples of what is radioactive terrain, the Allies were occupiers. I mean, there was Australians, Brits, and American troops taking rocks and anything they could find that wasn't nailed down in Hiroshima and Nagasaki as souvenirs. And this is when the ground's still heavily radioactive. It's just crazy. But yeah, they sent those teams in. I was going to say after the first attack on Hiroshima, and before Japan had surrendered, they sent their own scientists down to take tests too, because they were just trying to figure out, what have they dropped on us? We don't know yet. What is this thing? So they were doing the same thing. And again, if you Google it, you can find there's a few reports and some lovely photos as well of Japanese scientific teams doing their studies. But yeah, so these reports were done. Again, I can put it in a link afterwards and give you the website address to check.
Okay, thank you.
It's fascinating reading. Sorry, go on.
Okay, no, this is a fascinating conversation. Scott Grimmett is asking, if the Trinity test had failed, would the US have used the uranium bomb anyway? I mean, we have it kind of on this, if it hadn't worked, well, they weren't going to walk away from the project. They've spent $2 billion on
No,
it. So, but what would have
just,
happened if the Trinity test had not gone as expected?
they would have. I can't believe they would not have done another one. It just would
Yeah,
have. It's only one
reached
test.
it. Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, a lot of them were in two minds, or sitting on the fence, I should say. Will it work? Won't it work? They weren't sure. They didn't even know, really what kind of bomb blast
yeah,
can we expect? Because I was going to say the famous shot in the film where the lucky ones that got allowed closer to the blast and they're all taking bets with each other, and then they all have to lie down with goggles on, facing away from the blast. I think they were 6 miles from the blast, and afterwards, once they'd taken the tests and they analysed the blast radius, they're thinking, actually, we should have been 10 miles away to be really safe. So that goes to show. I mean, we just didn't. They didn't really have 100% idea of how effective it was going to be. But to get back to the question, yeah, you don't spend 3.8 billion pounds on the Manhattan Project and it didn't work. Let's lock it all up, boys. They would have carried on.
yeah.
The fighting was still going on. I mean, that wasn't stopping.
Yeah, I mean, I recorded a podcast this afternoon as the guest myself, and the subject of the atomic bombs came up, and as we had a comment in the sidebar from Stuart Burbridge, there is the argument that we looked at uni that the bomb drops were the first act of the Cold War rather than the last acts of the Second World War. And as you say, there's this the Soviet involvement, and it's a kind of it's a message to Stalin as well. It's a direct and very obvious message to the Japanese. It's an immediate message, but it's also a wider message to the world of the US has become a world player on the nuclear stage. And I think I'm kind of boil it down to the fact that in military terms, once something has been developed, be it a new fighter or a bomb, or even something like the creation of the Allied Airborne Army in August 1944, once you have a new thing that you've spent lots of money on, you're going to use it at some point.
Yeah.
So
of course.
if the atomic bomb hadn't been dropped, because there is, Stuart also asked you on a personally, Iain, do you think the bomb should have been dropped? And I'll let you answer that. But the thing is, as I said, you get to a certain point, a bomb is going to get used at some point. But
Absolutely.
do you have a response to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is, and this is the honest answer, because obviously the moral person in you thinks, well, we shouldn't have dropped the bomb. Of course we shouldn't have dropped the bomb. It's the worst option. But we see it from the vantage point of 80 years. And we see it from what we know about the Cold War. We're all children of the Cold War, or you and I are. So I grew up, and we're going to die in a nuclear holocaust eventually. But I genuinely believe. I think Truman, he's looking at it he's looking at what 7, 8, 9,000 casualties a week that are still coming in. He knows that they're on their knees, completely on their knees. Operation Starvation's working. They've bombed pretty much every city. They're bombing their rice crops. It would probably, I reckon, if they hadn't dropped the bomb and just carried on with the blockade, carried on with the bombing, Japan would have crumbled in 6 months. But again, he did have the Russians in his ear, so that maybe that was a slight excuse. But I think if you're the president and you're looking at all these casualties, you want to win it as quickly as possible. They come to you and say, "Oh, you didn't know about this, but we've got this bomb. You've just become president of the United States. And this super bomb. You're an artilleryman. You know all about power." And he goes, "Yeah, let's use it." So and he always said he'd use it again.
And you made the point clearly in the development of the B-29. You talked about Curtis LeMay and the firebombing. Is you can't treat the dropping of the atomic bomb as a separate lane. It's part of a wider, if we're going to carry the road analogy, wider highway of taking the war to Japan, as we are taking the war, the Axis, and the bombing in Germany. So it's the Allies are using the tools they now have in the toolbox, and the toolbox has got bigger and better with more expensive toys from 1940 and 41, and so technology is going to get used.
Having researched heavily the Great Tokyo Fire Raid, and there's a big chapter on it, and interviewed survivors. And in the end, what I did was, for that chapter, I just used one survivor's testimony. It's just so powerful. It just represents the whole thing. My argument would be, what is the difference between killing 100 to 200? They still don't know the answer. 100 to 200,000 civilians, men, women, and the elderly. Sorry, the children, women, and the elderly, with incendiaries, to dropping an atomic bomb. What is the difference? I don't mean that flippantly. I just mean you've still got. You know, it's if you're prepared to cross the Rubicon and use that kind of weapon, it's completely logical that you would use the atomic weapon. It's just well, mankind's been doing that. It's like you just said, that mankind's been trying to get that one-upmanship on their enemy since warfare began.
Yeah, I mean, the atomic bombs are kind of like Mike Tyson-like punches to the face, whereas a firebombing is repeated jabs over multiple rounds that still have the effect of putting the other opponent on the canvas, and that's not counting what's happening with everything else the Allies are bringing to bear on Japan, the gradual elimination of the island hopping campaign, the Okinawa, all that stuff as well. It's the stakes have increased, and that's just the reality. So we've got a couple of questions about the fallout. Now, Willie Robertson asked how much fallout was there and how did they clean it up, and I mean that's from the Japanese point of view, and Mr. Frickenfracken is asking about what they actually understood about fallout. So that's one of those terms, that fallout is something, we grew up, I had nuclear bomb practice things where we had to hide under the chairs, and I had a white painted potato sack I had to hide in. So fallout was a buzzword of our generation, and all that kind of stuff. But in all the studies of the Manhattan Project and all the science behind making the bomb work, were there anybody who were kind of looking at what the possibilities would have in terms of these long-term, as the effect of fallout and radiation and sickness and all that? Or was it all a complete surprise?
Well, it was a complete surprise, obviously, to the Japanese. So when their physicians and their medical teams that got to both cities are caring for the dead, well, the dying and the wounded, this is all, like I said, the symptoms that people started showing within days and weeks, and they're dying in their droves. That was, at the time, right then and there, it was just literally trying to care for them, and then watching them dying, then burying them. It's only as the months go on and more people start doing the same thing, that in Tokyo, definitely there was 2 or 3 really acclaimed physicians, professors of medicine, that would go down to Hiroshima and were starting to inspect and analyze people and making reports. Then when they were writing those reports, they were either shelved or they were dismissed because again, the Allies are in charge. And even though the American military was having teams down there, I was just going to say that the fear factor of radiation fallout hadn't happened yet, because it hadn't been expected. It hadn't been foreseen, I should say, about how over the weeks and months it would still be lingering and people would still be dying from it. So I think what they were trying to do at the time was they were just basically trying to secure the country and making sure that they had the populace locked in, and then they would deal with the issues about what to do with all the bomb cities, because the whole country had been bombed. How do they start rebuilding? The atomic situation was just one part of the jigsaw that they had to fix. But what they did have, which is what I said earlier, and I go into detail in the book, is it's just the suppression, the censorship of any kind of free press to try and break any kind of story about it. There was official junkets that were very staged managed and man-managed by the US military, where they would fly people into Hiroshima and then they're flying them straight out again 24 hours later. They didn't have much time to meet anyone, interview anyone. They were just taken to the famous sites. Look at this, look at the atomic bomb, this is what we've done. And it was much, much later. Like I said, it's well over a year later. But the radiation hanging around, I don't really know the answer to that. I'd have to look it up. I mean, they started rebuilding Hiroshima Obviously people were living in shacks for the first 6 to 9 months,
Mm.
and then they started getting the necessary supplies and equipment in to start the rebuild. But that took years and
Yeah.
years.
So I wanted to get a bit to ask you about the writing process, because it occurs to me that writing about Hiroshima, writing about 1945, as you said there, you've got to look at things from the point of view of what the information that was available at the time. So if you're studying something like, I don't know, the crossing of the Rhine in 1945, then the debates about which army should have made a crossing first, or should they have gone early, or should have Operation Adversity, it all ended with V-Day. The discussions and the debates become completely moot. The war's over. There's no relevance to it. So you can completely just frame a study of those campaigns rooted in that 1945 period. But in writing about what you're writing about with this, as it's come up repeated in the sidebar, it does herald a new age. It does absolutely affect the world we're living in today, the world we grew up in. So how did you balance as a historian that okay, keep it rooted into what General Groves knew at the time, keep it rooted into what they understood now, but also the fact that you can't help being a human being who have lived through the nuclear age? How did you obviously, there are conclusions, there are epilogues, things like that, but
Yeah.
how did you balance that?
Well, because I was looking, I started off the research. I spent the first 3-4 months of the research, because the research was 2 years. And the first 3 or 4 months, all I looked at was reports on how the American public had reacted to the dropping of the bomb, and then how that reaction had changed over the next 2 to 3 years before you get into the Cold War. And it was, it was interesting in terms of, like I showed with the tribute to victory. For the first year or so, it was pretty much 9 out of 10 Americans thought it was the best thing that they could have done, and there was even more Americans thought we should have carried on the bombing, that kind of thing. It was very justifiable. The whole issue was justifiable, and then so I got that. So I put that in the book, but then I wanted to take the reader, evolve that theory, and say, okay, well, and did that erode over time? And it really only started eroding once people like John Hersey had got there and were telling the story, because that's the cushion. That is that period of time that's a cushion between the war's finished, the glow's starting to fade about how it was won, and what's coming next, before we have the thaw with the freeze with the Russians, and we're into the Cold War. And it's really like you were just saying, someone said, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is the start of the Cold War. I think really the Cold War really heats up when the hydrogen bombs get tested, because that's when the Russians are in the game, then properly in the game, and they've got the technology to hit America, which had never happened before. And that's where you think both sides have the ability to, like you were on about, is one side has one-upmanship on the other to give the biggest slap. And by the time you get to the early 50s, both sides can give each other, they think anyway, the Americans believed all the propaganda from Russia. They believe they can hit us as hard as we can hit them. And that's where you get the Cold War really, in my view anyway, it really begins.
Yeah. Now people are saying what a fascinating presentation it was, and balanced views, which is fantastic. A great question from Fraser there about, can you ask Iain what documents you'd have liked to have had access but couldn't get? Were there any particular things that you kind of heard about or got an inkling existed that you couldn't get to, or couldn't find, or didn't exist?
See, the silver bullet, Woody, the silver bullet is
There's always a silver bullet.
Exactly. No one's got it. I was talking about it to an author today, because he asked me the same question. Was there any letter given to Roosevelt, to Truman, about whether I don't know. There's an argument that Truman knew more than he was letting on about whether the Japanese would surrender, and whether he was giving any documentation that proved that. And I was asked, if you ever found anything like that? I said, I've never seen anything like that. If I had it, it'd be in the book, but it's got to be verified, and I have never seen it. And I've had 3 or 4 people ask me that question already, about Truman knew more than he was letting on, and he wanted to use the atomic bombs. And my argument, as I said earlier on, is I think he's a war leader. He's a warlord, as AJP Taylor would say. And if he's given the ordnance, and he's an ordnance man, he used it. But that's one of the things. And then on a research trip, the only thing I was disappointed not to do was Los Alamos and Trinity. Well, Trinity mainly. The Trinity site obviously is still a military site. It's huge security around it. Twice a year they open it up just for a day, 24 hours, and you have to book way in advance. And sod's law, Richard Groves, General Groves' grandson, said to me, I can get us in. Well, he goes all the time because of his name, but he said, I'm going this October. You'll be my guest. Can you come over? I was in my day job as a publisher. I had to go to this book fair and I couldn't get out of it. I was almost, what's left of my hair, I was almost pulling out. That's the one thing I would love, because again, it's you're visiting a massively important historic site, and I would love to have gone to it. I can't, and you can only get in twice a year.
Wow. I think we will kind of bring things to an end, but I think this is clearly a subject that the humankind will be discussing in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, whereas there clearly are some battles from World War II and even some figures from World War II where their influence and the battle's influence ended the moment the battle came to an end. But this is an event that will just keep on being relevant as long as we live with the technology that was created by it. And it's I think these people, the Tibbets and other people who've given this voice to all these years after their deaths, I mean, they were just part of something that will be discussed forever, and people will always come out. And as predicted, Dresden's come up, firebombings come up, morality has come up there. It always will with these discussions, because no matter how much people are interested in tanks and armor and aircraft, things like that, mass civilians dying, if you're not sympathetic to that, regardless of what nation they are from, you've got to have a heart of stone. And I think that adds that complexity to people who say I love World War II. I know what people mean when they say that. They mean they love investigating the history, but we don't really love World War II because it's a very costly event in which millions die. We like discussing it. We love discussing it, but the suffering at Hiroshima and Nagasaki just brings it home, just the tragedy of it all. So
yeah, I mean, it's the ultimate in terror bombing.
Yeah,
really. But as I think I said it in the book with Tibbets, he was asked all the time, as after the war, about how could he justify it, et cetera, et cetera. And he said, I think he snapped at the reporter and he said, there is no morality in war. There is no morality in war. He said, you look at what we used in the Second World War. I'm paraphrasing him here, by the way. But he said, you look at what we used in the war. Why is the atomic bomb any different?
Yeah.
He said, it's killing people. He said that war kills people.
And at least, I mean, we're going down a massive rabbit hole. At least,
well, we are, of course.
We as human beings are having the discussion about the morality of it all. Because if God forbid the Nazis had got that power at the beginning of the war, they wouldn't have had any qualms about using it. They wouldn't have been worried about what. At least there were voices of reason. There were people going, should we? Can we? Will we? And that Oppenheimer, particularly, someone clearly driven, but also conflicted by various things over the course of his career, and then eventually, kind of, as you said, kind of not embraced it as such, but came to terms with it and go, yeah, this is it, and sort of change his course a bit. But anyway, you've got 32 book signings and book and historical events and speaking events over the next few months. So it's June the 5th in the UK and July in the USA, but you can order it now, folks.
Yeah. So the top of the presentations are two different covers. So there's the Brit, there's the US one.
Yeah, so, and there's my copy there because I get an early one because I'm special. So, folks, as I say, tomorrow's show is 1 hour later. Then we've got one with Seth from the Unauthorized History of the Pacific on Friday, talking about what happened in the Pacific after V-Day in Europe to the end of the war in the Pacific. So, probably mention some of the things we've been doing today again with Seth. So I'm looking forward to his viewpoint on that. But as always, click like and subscribe, buy my guest books. I will see you all tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Cheers, Iain. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Good night.